Hey folks, thanks very much for joining our part 2 of this anti-catabolic series. Part 1 last week on ketones, this week on protein. Well, before we jump in, I hope you're watching the spectacle in France unfold, the World Championships there for the Ironman. Awesome to see some awesome results across all athletes, all age groups, and of course the pros. Well, today we're going to jump into this subject straight away. We're going to get a little deep into protein and its role in anti-catabolic support. There is some watch items for you, absolutely, as you apply protein in your diet to maximize your performance in endurance sport. I'm going to jump straight into this and share our content. Like we said, this is part 2 of our series. If you haven't had a chance yet, go back and firstly check out part 1 on ketones up on YouTube. I'll put the link up here in this video. Well, so now we're going to jump onto protein. And for a lot of folks, it's a interesting nutrient in that we think we're doing the right thing. We think we're taking enough, but it's actually what you find is in a lot of cases, it's simply not the case. And when we think about catabolism and breaking down of tissue, most athletes, of course, will think that is most and foremost a muscle comment. Well, on the left-hand side, firstly, let's just call out that there is a difference between muscle damage, which happens, in most workouts. There is a degree of micro damage, if you will, to muscle tissue, and you can see that in the blood. What we're talking about here, though, is a far more aggressive state whereby, like we said in the first part A of the series, is that the demands for calories is higher than is being made available, and the body will begin to break down, if you will, muscle tissue in supporting the energy requirement of the body. And you have this, if you will, outbound efflux of amino acids from the muscles, and that gets converted into energy. But what's usually not well understood is that it's not just that protein lack and the breaking down, if you will, catabolism of muscle tissue is really the only thing at stake here. When we see an imbalance or a shortage, a deficiency of protein, this could be affecting a whole set of enzymes and protein, other aspects of protein in the body, whether that is things like hemoglobin in the blood, which is moving the oxygen around the blood, of course, the muscle tissue itself, but even hormones, insulin, thyroxine, all of these things come about through proteins. Even the very gut lining is fueled by protein. Fibroblasts, that which actually builds structure in our connective tissue, uses protein as the fuel. Immune cells use protein, particularly glutamine, as the fuel. Muscles, like glutamine, also can use protein as a fuel. Well, obviously, protein is required in a lot of parts of the body to make sure that we remain healthy and well. And it's not surprising of what can happen when you look at the amounts, and I'm going to talk on that soon. But for an endurance athlete, it is this balancing act, because we actually want some aspects of catabolism, particularly as it relates to the breakdown of fat, the lipolysis, the breaking down of fat, and the oxidation of fat. We want to get very efficient at that. But at the same time, we do want to have this, if you will, at least balance whereby muscle mass is being maintained. And this is, in the case of protein, if we get it wrong, we can have, a catabolic state where we're on the left-hand side seeing insufficient amounts of protein being made available. And as a function of that, having muscle tissue being broken down and the catabolism happening to support the energy requirements. Or on the right-hand side, if we're taking either not the optimal forms or the timing's wrong, we can actually be spiking insulin. I'm going to show you some data on that in a second, which is quite interesting. But what we're really looking for, of course, is this situation where we can have the optimal amount of protein that's not affecting our continued efficiency on fat oxidation. At the same time, we're taking the optimal amount to support and maintain muscle mass. Well, as I said, The amounts are important, and so is the timing. It does come back to this right fuel, right time concept, even for protein, not just for carbohydrates and fats. So these few bullet points here is 3 of actually 14 bullet points that the Sports Nutrition Society put out on their positioning statement as it relates to protein for athletes. And I'll make sure I put the links to these down in the show notes. But the second and third bullet points give some very specific guidance on the range of protein intake per day really required. Point 2 is really required for the maintaining of muscle mass. And the call out here, of course, is 1.4 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And that is sufficient. But the third bullet point is really interesting. And that is, it's a heightened level, 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram per day. And the reference there is during hypocaloric periods. And again, this is in trying to, if you will, offset the threat of a catabolic situation, the breaking down of fat. And for endurance athletes, they do go through, whether it's training blocks or even big weekends of training sessions in lining up for an A race coming up. Those periods of time could be where we get into these hypercaloric periods. Now, again, there is the breaking down of muscle threat to that, but like I just showed you on the slide before, that can be immunity issues, that can be gut issues, and we absolutely see this with elite age groupers and professional athletes. They get in close to a race, and they come down with an infection. They're more susceptible to gut infections. We see in extreme cases, endurance athletes, ultra athletes, Ironman athletes, we absolutely see catabolic states, breaking down of muscle tissue. So these are the types of, intake requirements to maintain muscle mass during those periods of heavy training. Now, let me show you the practicality of that, because you can easily say, well, you need 2 to 3 grams per day, but how does it actually come about? What does it look like when you do the math on this? So let's say you're a 70 kilogram athlete. So if you were, or that's about 150, 155 pounds in body weight. If you were exercising, let's just say normally, in other words, maybe not your big blocks, you're 5 times a week you're training, the general guidance there would be, like I said, 2 grams per kilogram body weight. So that means you're 140 grams per day you would require. And that's just for general, exercise 5 times a week. Let's just say that. On the right-hand side, 30 grams of protein comes out of 130 grams of chicken. So when you're having 130 grams of chicken, only 30 grams of that is protein. 170 grams of a ribeye steak has 30 grams of protein. 120 grams of salmon has 30 grams of protein. So when you look across these kind of more classic proteins that we have, and they're all great sources of protein, don't be confused by what you weigh or the amount you take as thinking that, well, all of that is protein. In fact, it's quite a fraction of the total weight of the meat in these cases, or eggs, that are showed here on this chart. And this is why you see that for athletes, the supplementation, and typically it's in the form of, and there's different forms, and we can talk about that, of whey, which is a extract, of course, in dairy. It can be an extract out of some plant proteins, but the use of whey protein is supplemented in addition to classic meats and eggs in order to get to these amounts that the guidance is giving. If you were to be in the 70 kilogram, 155 pounds in body weight, and you're looking for 140 to 210 grams of protein per day, that would mean that you would need to have 5 to 7 serves of these proteins you see on the right-hand side here. Now, typically, breakfast, you might have, maybe you have some eggs, etc. Lunch, you might have some chicken or whatever, and a dinner, you might have another meat, fish or beef or whatever it is. But even still, that would just be 3. You would still need to find 2 other serves of 30-gram protein serves. And again, this is why, you see whey protein has had, such a marked growth over the past 30, 40 years, as we realize, particularly for athletes, how much is needed. Whey protein was, applied historically, even for, if you will, sarcopenic, meaning like muscle loss in aged people. It was applied to even arthritic cases. That was a clinical application of whey protein. So, it's been around for a long time, but the rise of it has really been tied out to athletes, either in muscle gain resistance exercise or in endurance athletes, where we're just trying to maintain muscle mass in light of all of the particularly aerobic training demands that endurance athletes conduct. So here's another aspect, though. If we're going to have to take that much protein, is there any other aspects we should be conscious of in terms of how it affects the body? And particularly I want to call out here insulin. And as you know, if you've been watching SFuels for some time, that, of course, insulin typically has a detrimental effect to fat oxidation efficiency by design. It shuts down fatty acid oxidation. And as an endurance athlete, we absolutely want efficient and ongoing fatty acid oxidation. This chart it's kind of a consolidation of three parts of the same chart, but in trying to put this on a page so you can see it. And again, I'll put the link down in the show notes and you can check out all the foods that were in this chart. But what I wanted to show here is in the top of this chart, top third, a number of protein type foods. In the middle white box is a number of classic carbohydrate loaded foods. And in the bottom is some dairy and also some confectionery. Just to give context, because as you can see in this chart, even taking eggs, which, I don't think there is generally a lot of assumption that eggs was something that can stimulate insulin in the body. Well, it can. In fact, cheese has about the same insulinogenic effect as white pasta. If you go down the bottom of this chart, yogurt, for example. Now, yogurt's a fairly generic term. It could be yogurt packed with sugar. It could be, whole fat Greek yogurt, natural, which doesn't have a lot of sugar. So it's a little bit generic, this term. I think the reference here, by just looking at the insulinogenic effect, it's probably one of the ones that is loaded with sugar. But you can see in the middle of this chart how carbohydrates, of course, have the effect on insulin, which I think we well know. But if you were to, prior to a workout in lunchtime, for example, take on a bunch of fish, and that later that day you had a workout for the day, you may find that your blood sugars are low and your energy levels for that session is low because of the insulinogenic effect that you had from your lunchtime meal. So this is important to think about as we think about, again, the timing of this macronutrient protein, and just think about where to place it best relative to training, that we can still maintain the protein intake, but it doesn't have any degrading effect, either fatty acid oxidation or on blood sugar levels going into training. So let me show you some research that really looks at this a little deeper and puts a little more color on giving us maybe some best practices on how to do this right. So this slide here has the left-hand side, one study, the right-hand side, another study. In fact, the left-hand side is a, if you will, analysis of a number of studies looking at this question of how do different proteins affect insulin and glucose. And if you look at just on the left-hand side, the top two charts, on the left is insulin and on the right is glucose. And you can see here that these line charts on the left-hand side here showing insulin spiking in about 30 minutes. And the strongest element that is spiking is whey. And then if you look just to the right of that,
still on the left-hand side of the chart, but the right line chart, it's showing glucose, and you'll see that at 60 minutes, blood glucose has crashed. And these studies mostly were done in a non-activity state, low or no activity prior to this testing. And without going into all the details, there's a lot more interesting things in this study. But if you go to the right-hand side, which is also looking at whey protein, you'll see at the bottom on the right-hand side, again, the insulin in about 30 minutes, getting to that peak amount there. And then if you look at the chart above it, however, glucose is flat. Well, that's just the opposite of what we saw on the left-hand side. Why is that? What's different? Well, the right-hand study was done post-exercise, meaning the whey protein was taken post-exercise, and it was also all done later in the day. And this starts to give us insight to think about the use of protein, when to use it, maybe when not to use it. And again, this is all in the spirit of an athlete, an endurance athlete. This is in the spirit of ensuring we offset the catabolic effect. At the same time, we don't want to go into training sessions in a low blood glucose state that we have no energy to actually execute. One of the interesting things on this right-hand study also, though, was that the concern, of course, when the insulin went up like it has here, whether that would have any effect on, offsetting or diluting the oxidation of fatty acids. And it was found that some of the transporters, particularly some of the protein or the RNA expressions of the transporters, and this particular transporter on the mitochondria called CD36, its job is to take long-chain fatty acids, which is generally what comes out of the fatty tissue. It comes from the blood, it comes into the cells, and then it comes into the mitochondria through these transporters called CD36. And those were actually heightened post this whey protein intake, which is an interesting finding. Now, just to take, though, this whole context of insulin, and does it have a negative effect by taking this high dose of protein before a workout? Does it have effect on fatty acid oxidation? And again, we will stay with whey protein. This study was actually done in New Zealand at the Auckland University of Technology, and this study was looking at athletes, about 17 cyclists that would come into the session, and they were all fasted, but then they were either given a carbohydrate meal, they remained fasted, or they were given a protein and fat meal. And you can see here, so the blue is the y-axis, the vertical axis is fat oxidation. And you'll see that the green, which is the fasted state, which you would expect to have the highest fat oxidation still in these workouts, but the blue is right there with it. Hardly any difference, really, in terms of fatty acid oxidation, where the red, after having all that carbohydrate, absolutely the fat oxidation was blunted. And this was done at different intensities. So VT, meaning ventilatory threshold. And as you went right up to 100% of VT, and then even after that, there was even a higher heightened intensity, basically between peak and your ventilatory threshold. And you can see still that the fatty acid oxidation remained. So what this study is showing us is that even with whey, with some, and in this case, it was 25 grams of whey and 33 grams of peanut butter, so a mix of proteins and some fat, and you could see that fat oxidation remained very high in these, quite high intensities of exercise, and there certainly wasn't a blunting in fat oxidation. So how do we take all of this? Well, I'm going to get into the overall practical application in terms of how to offset the catabolic threat in the next slide. And that will look at both ketones and protein. And I just want to summarize, though, for protein, though, firstly, you're probably going to be, as an endurance athlete, need to be in that 2 to 3 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. And it's going to be closer to the 2 if it's, let's just say, lower load, lower volume, lower intensity. Of course, if you get to the higher intensity, higher volume, higher load, it's going to be closer to the 3 plus of grams of protein per day. Now, because of that amount, you're likely going to need a supplement beyond, classic meats and eggs, what have you. And typically that's in the form of whey. There is a whole debate on plant and, dairy-based whey. I'll let you make your decision. Our own opinion is that the dairy whey has the strongest nitrogen retention rate. I think there is a very important environmental aspect to whey as it relates to dairy whey, as opposed to plant whey, which you may think is environmentally positive. I don't think that's the case. And the only thing I would say that then when using a dairy whey, because of its heightened nitrogen retention rate or protein retention rate, is that you use the isolate or the hydrolysate only in the spirit of minimizing the amount of lactose that comes with that. In a isolate, 90, 93, 95%, somewhere thereabouts of the lactose is removed. In a hydrolysate, this is for true tested lactose intolerant individuals where there is no lactose. That would be your best option. The watch item, of course, is in fasted states, is watching that you don't overconsume these highly insulinogenic proteins, fish, beans, that can raise these insulin levels and lower your blood glucose. This is probably not ideal going into a training session with this happening. Post-exercise whey protein, obviously it shows positive impact to muscle protein synthesis and even suggestions of heightened fatty acid transporters, which is interesting. But in a pre-exercise context, I would probably be looking to, at least less than 25, if not less than 20 grams of protein per dose as a single dose, and have that with some fat. It will just slow the effect of the insulinogenic effect. It doesn't seem to have too much impact on fatty acid oxidation at most intensities in workout. So keep it a little lower, have it with some fat, and I think you'll find that will maintain your fat oxidation while still going into the workout with energy and with satiety. You're feeling like you're in a fed state coming into your workout. So let's put all this together. From part 1 last week to part 2 this week on protein, bring it all together. Let's go from left to right. Pre-racing and pre-workout. Like we said last week, it's very clear that a dose of ketones can absolutely, have that dulling effect of blood glucose, of fat oxidation and lipolysis. We absolutely encourage to have the protein and fat going into a workout. Probably sub 20 grams of protein is best. And this will allow you to, like we said, have the energy going into the workout, feeling satisfied. You're not hungry, but you're not dulling your fat oxidation, and you're still taking in the protein to ensure you stay in that balanced state. So the Life Bar is a good example of a product that can support that. Doesn't have the sugar and the carbs, has that sub 20 gram of fat in quality healthy fats, and a good dose of the whey protein included in there. During the workout, of course, we want to maintain and support our fat oxidation. Particularly, we want to support that during the first 2 hours. And as we get into workout sessions beyond 2 hours, we want to add some carbohydrate. And a lot of this, of course, is around just keeping your caloric load up while maintaining fat oxidation efficiency. And glutamine, of course, will further help those effects. And again, I'll put the link up here in the video, and you can check out our video just on glutamine and its role for, if you will, maintaining glycogen levels in the muscles needed for, if you will, your next workout. And then on the right-hand side, finally, post-workout. And, I think there's a lot of good evidence that would suggest that certainly straight after a workout, the retention and the absorption rate of protein is very high. But generally, if you look across the studies, they would suggest that over the 24 hours, in fact, after the workout, there is a heightened, if you will, utilization of protein by taking it in. So when I say here protein to 2 to 3 grams per kilogram body weight, I'm not suggesting take all of that just in a single dose, but I would space it out across the day. But when you work it all out for your body weight, it should be in that range of 2 to 3 grams per body weight. But absolutely, we should take one of those doses after our workouts to maximize the effect. Glutamine, 5 to 10 grams per day is in a good spot, and same for ketones. Now, for ketones, I would just say this is specific to anti-catabolic topic. This is what we've been discussing on part A and part B. There is a whole separate discussion, of course, on the role of ketones as a substrate, as a fuel in training, in racing, another topic, and excellent data coming out on that, on its role, whether that is to support improved erythropoietins, that we can increase our red blood cell count, etc. There's some really good data on that, but specific to anti-catabolic states, our guidance would be you want to be in that 5 to 10 gram per dose day. Overall, of course, we have to keep our caloric load healthy, and we can absolutely achieve that through a lower carbohydrate, higher fat intake in the diet. Look, I hope you've enjoyed over the past 2 weeks us covering this really interesting topic of anti-catabolic strategies through nutrition with ketones, protein, and glutamine. I wish you all the very best in training and racing, and like always, go run.